in the damp stone corridors of a medieval castle, where the air carried the mingled scents of smoke, roasted meat, and wet earth. The kitchen was more than just a place of cooking. It was a world hidden beneath the grandeur of halls and the brutality of battlefields. The kitchen was the silent heart of survival, a place where daily life revealed itself in ways that the great tapestries and chronicles never recorded. It was where the maiden bent over coarse bread, her fingers raw from kneading, her back stooped from labor. Here, in the hidden kitchen, the truth of the medieval world was baked into every loaf of bread, simmered into every pot of stew, and whispered through every hushed prayer uttered over dwindling supplies. To imagine this world, you must step away from the glamorous image of feasts and banquets. The glittering halls with golden goblets and roasted boars stuffed with apples were real, yes, but they were spectacles reserved for the few. For most of the people in medieval Europe, food was not abundance, but survival. Bread was not merely bread. It was life, politics, and even religion. And the maiden, often nameless in the grand chronicles of kings and knights, was the one whose hands ensured that life continued. Bread itself was so central to survival that it became a reflection of one's class and fate. For the lords, the bread was white, finely sifted, soft. For the poor, it was black, coarse, made from rye or barley or whatever grain could be scavenged. In times of famine, bread became something darker still. Some records tell of people mixing ground bark, weeds, or even clay into dough, creating loaves that poisoned as much as they nourished. To knead such bread was an act of desperation. To eat it was to gamble with death. The kitchen in this way was not merely domestic, it was political, even spiritual. And within this hidden world of kitchens, the maiden's role was far more than servitude. She was a guardian of knowledge. Recipes were not written in books for the common folk. They were carried in memory, passed down from hand to hand, whisper to whisper. A maiden who knew how to stretch grain in famine, how to salt meat before it rotted, or how to spice a bitter stew so it could still be eaten. She held power. Power that was invisible in the great chronicles, but palpable in the lives of those who relied on her. But the medieval kitchen was not only about nourishment, it was also a place of ritual and superstition. Fire itself was sacred. The hearth was seen as the boundary between the living world and the world of spirits. A fire that went out in the kitchen was more than an inconvenience. It was an omen. Maidens were sometimes instructed to whisper charms over the flames, or to throw a pinch of salt into the fire to keep evil spirits at bay. Every pot, every loaf, every cauldron was touched by this unseen world of belief. Salt itself was more than a seasoning. It was wealth and preservation. Salted meats lasted longer. Salted fish could feed soldiers on campaign. In some regions, salt was so precious it became currency. To spill salt was not just clumsy, it was dangerous. A bad omen that might invite misfortune. To this day, the superstition of throwing salt over one's shoulder lingers, a faint echo of those medieval kitchens. The maiden's world was not gentle. Her body bore the marks of it. The burns from open flames, the cuts from heavy knives, the ache of carrying water in wooden pails from distant wells. Kitchens were dangerous places, filled with smoke that stung the eyes, fires that could rage out of control, and the constant threat of vermin. Rats skittered through storerooms, gnawed at sacks of grain, carried disease in their filthy fur. To guard the food was also to guard life itself. Yet, amid this hardship, there was also a strange kind of intimacy. To prepare food was to be bound to the rhythms of others. The maiden might never sit at the Lord's table, but the bread she kneaded would pass his lips. The ale she brewed might warm his nights. The stew she stirred might sustain the peasants who tilled the Lord's fields. Her labor connected her, invisibly, to every stratum of medieval society. But the hidden kitchen also held its secrets, secrets darker than spoiled grain or burnt meat. Medieval medicine often blurred the line between food and cure, between kitchen and apothecary. Herbs were mixed into broths not only for flavor, but for healing or sometimes for harm. A stew could carry rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, or henbane for visions. In whispered corners, some maidens learned which roots and powders could bring sleep, which could stir desire, and which could end a life. Poison was not the stuff of distant assassins alone. It was often brewed in the kitchen. And yet, despite this weight of labor, superstition, and danger, the maiden's kitchen was also a place of resilience. Consider the winter months, when the fields were barren, when larders grew thin, when hunger stalked even the wealthy. It was in the kitchen that survival was conjured. Thin porridge stretched with water, hard bread softened with broth, cheeses ripened in hidden cellars. The maiden's ingenuity kept families alive when the world outside froze. Still, we must not romanticize it too much. For the maiden, life in the kitchen was not a choice, but a condition of her existence. She belonged to the kitchen as much as the kitchen belonged to her. Many were bound by service, by class, by gender, with little chance of escape. The kitchen, hidden from the chronicles, became both her cage and her domain. And this is why the hidden kitchen of the maiden matters. Not because of great feasts or royal banquets, but because it reveals the truth of how people survived, how they believed, how they labored, and how they suffered. History, after all, is not only the story of kings and battles, it is the story of the bread that was baked, the salt that was spilled, the fires that were kept alive. Before we journey deeper into this world, pause for a moment and consider, how often do we imagine history through the taste of bread, the crackle of firewood, the scent of herbs crushed beneath a maiden's hand? Too often, history is told from the high table. But here, in the smoke and shadows of the hidden kitchen, the true medieval world comes alive. And if you're still with me now, ask yourself, what other forgotten truths hide behind the walls of history? The kitchen of the maiden is only the beginning. If you want to keep exploring the secrets history has buried, the rituals, the hardships, the strange and disturbing truths, then make sure you subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment about which medieval food you'd dare to try, and share the story so others can step into the hidden kitchen too. Because the journey ahead is about to get darker, stranger, and far more revealing. The deeper we venture into the heart of the medieval household, the more invisible its hidden arteries become. If the banquet hall was the stage where lords and ladies displayed their wealth and power, the kitchen was the backstage, the place where all illusions were crafted, where the rough alchemy of earth and fire turned into polished spectacle. But behind the gleaming silver plates and gilded goblets of the ruling elite lay a truth that was harder, dirtier, and often darker than the feasts it produced. To understand the hidden kitchen of the maiden, we must descend below the surface into the smoke, the sweat, and the sheer human labor that kept these castles alive. In the medieval world, the kitchen was less a room and more an ecosystem. The grand stone hearth was the anchor, but everything around it was a machine of human bodies working in synchrony. At the heart of this machine were not trained chefs in the modern sense, but young maidens, scullions, and apprentices. Their names have long been forgotten, for history rarely cared to record them. But without them, no feast would have been possible. They were the invisible hands of survival, endlessly chopping, fetching, grinding, and cleaning. Their day began before dawn and often ended past midnight. For many, the kitchen was not just a workplace, but a prison. Picture the early morning in a medieval castle. The sun had not yet risen, but in the kitchen, fires already roared. Maidens stumbled half asleep into the dark, carrying buckets of water drawn from the well, their hands raw from the cold. They lugged sacks of flour ground at the castle's mill, knowing that bread was the cornerstone of every meal. A castle might consume hundreds of loaves in a single day, each one kneaded and shaped by hand, baked in ovens that required constant tending. The maiden's fingers cracked and burned from pulling bread from the heat, but no one praised her for it. Bread was expected like air. Her toil was invisible, And yet, bread was not equal. The Lord's household ate fine white loaves made from sifted wheat flour, while servants ate coarse brown bread laced with rye, oats, or even ground beans. For the poor, sometimes the bread was mixed with ground acorns, chestnuts, or sawdust to stretch supplies. The difference in bread was the difference in status, and the kitchen reproduced that hierarchy with every loaf. The kitchen was also a place of constant danger. Fires blazed in open hearths, oil hissed, knives flashed. Burns, cuts, and smoke-choked lungs were daily realities. Many maidens bore permanent scars, their bodies testaments to lives spent in service of meals they never tasted. Even worse was the punishment for mistakes. A burnt joint of meat or spilled wine could lead to lashes, beatings, or worse, for food was wealth, and waste was treated as theft. In the hidden kitchen, failure had no forgiveness. But danger was not only physical. There was also the constant shadow of hunger. Ironically, those who cooked the feasts were often the ones who went to bed hungry. A roast swan prepared for the Lord as table would never reach the lips of the maiden who basted it for hours. The rule of the kitchen was simple. The closer you stood to the Lord, the better you ate. Servants at the very bottom lived on scraps, gnawing bones discarded from the high table, drinking thin ale that was more water than grain. To steal from the kitchen was tempting but perilous. Many maidens risked their lives for a stolen apple or a piece of cheese, slipping food into hidden pockets when the steward's back was turned. Some were caught and branded thieves for life. Still, not all was misery. Within the smoky walls of the kitchen, a unique sisterhood was forged. Maidens worked shoulder to shoulder, whispering secrets as they scrubbed cauldrons, sharing stolen crumbs in dark corners. For many, the kitchen was also where they first learned the survival skills of womanhood, how to manage scarcity, how to endure hardship, how to navigate the constant threat of men's eyes watching their every move. In many castles, maidens were as vulnerable to exploitation as they were to burns and cuts. Their bodies were commodities, and the kitchen's dark corners could become sites of abuse. Chroniclers rarely wrote of it, but whispered stories passed down through generations speak of maidens used and discarded, their silence bought with bread. The hidden kitchen was not just a place of work. It was a microcosm of medieval society. Here we see the stratification of wealth, the invisibility of women's labor, and the unrelenting cruelty of survival. Meat, the prize of the noble table, was rarely tasted by the poor. While lords feasted on venison, boar, and roasted peacocks adorned with feathers for spectacle, maidens might never taste more than broth from bones. Meat was a luxury that reinforced hierarchy. To eat flesh was to display power. To live on grains and vegetables was to exist at the bottom. But the kitchen was also a place of extraordinary ingenuity. Medieval cooks, often guided by the hands of maidens, learned to stretch the smallest ingredients into something sustaining. Pottages, the thick stews of the poor, contained whatever could be foraged: turnips, onions, leeks, beans. Herbs from the garden added flavor, while bones simmered for hours gave the illusion of meat. These humble stews fed more people than any feast and kept countless households alive. The maiden's role was crucial here. She foraged, she chopped, she stirred, she tasted. Her unseen art was not gilded swans, but the quiet alchemy of making scraps into sustenance. And yet, the castle kitchen was also a stage of spectacle. Feasts were as much about theater as they were about nourishment. Maidens watched in silence as cooks stuffed peacocks, not just for eating, but for display, its roasted body redressed in its own feathers, a grotesque resurrection meant to awe guests. Jellies molded into castles, pies with live birds hidden inside, sugar sculptures glittering like jewels. These were designed to impress foreign ambassadors, visiting nobles, or even kings. But for every spectacle on the high table, a dozen maidens labored unseen in the back, their fingerprints smudged into every dish, though no guest would ever know. Perhaps the most haunting truth of the hidden kitchen is this: it was a place of erasure. We know the names of kings, queens, even the master cooks who sometimes rose to fame. But the maidens who hauled the buckets, kneaded the bread, plucked the birds, and wiped the grease from the flagstones remain nameless. They exist only as shadows in the records, sometimes mentioned in household roles as a servant, sometimes not at all. Their work built the foundations of daily life, but their voices have been lost. And yet, if we listen closely to the silences of history, we can almost hear them. The quiet singing as they kneaded dough, the muffled laughter at stolen moments of levity, the tired sigh as they collapsed onto straw pallets after hours at the hearth. The hidden kitchen was not just a place of labor, it was a place of living, of dreaming, of enduring. It was where the unnamed women of medieval history carried entire worlds on their backs. The hidden kitchen of the Maiden is therefore more than a story of food. It is a story of survival, of inequality, of invisible strength. It is a reminder that history's grand feasts were built on the backs of the nameless, and that behind every shining hall was a smoky, blistered, weary room where maidens labored in silence. And this silence brings us to the next question. What did it mean for a maiden to dream in such a place? If her days were consumed with the endless grind of survival, what hopes flickered in her heart at night? Did she dream of freedom, of marriage, of escape, or did she only dream of bread that was hers to eat? In part 3, we will follow the hidden thread of the maiden's private world. Beyond the smoke and the toil of the kitchen lies her secret life, the rituals, the whispered prayers, the forbidden loves, and the small rebellions that kept her humanity alive in a world determined to erase it. The smoke of the kitchen might have filled her lungs by day, but at night, the maiden carried a different kind of fire-quiet dreams, smoldering beneath the weight of duty. To understand the hidden kitchen fully, we must now step beyond the walls of labor and survival and enter the private, unseen lives of those who toiled within. For the maiden, time was not her own. Bells ruled the rhythms of the castle. Matins at dawn, meals at midday, vespers in the evening. Yet even within this strict order, small slivers of freedom existed. After the fires were banked, after the last trenchers had been scraped, after the steward's footsteps faded, she might sit on her straw pallet and carve her own world out of whispers, prayers, and stolen moments. Her body was weary, but her mind still wandered. What did she dream of? Perhaps escape running from the castle into the woods, free of the ever-burning hearth. Or perhaps marriage, not to a noble lord, but to a miller, a blacksmith, or even a fellow servant. Marriage, for many maidens, was the only door out of the kitchen. Yet it was also a gamble, for the bonds of matrimony often exchanged one form of labor for another. Still, to dream was an act of resistance. In a world that reduced her to hands and back, her dreams insisted on her humanity. But alongside dreams came fear. A maiden's reputation was as fragile as the eggs she carried to the kitchens each morning. A glance from the wrong man, a rumor whispered in the wrong ear, and her entire future could collapse. She might be dismissed, cast into the streets with nothing but her worn shift. Many faced far worse: exploitation in the shadows of the kitchen, their voices silenced by power and threat. The chronicles do not record their names, but silence itself speaks. For every feast that echoed through castle halls, there were secrets swallowed in the smoke. Religion offered comfort and a kind of structure. The kitchen maiden lived in a world saturated with faith. She prayed before dawn, crossed herself before the hearth, whispered Ave Marias as she scrubbed pots. Small tokens of protection hung in kitchens, charms against fire, prayers against burns, herbs hung from rafters to ward off evil. The maiden might have tied her hopes to these small rituals, believing that if she kept faith, her suffering would not be in vain. And sometimes, faith was the only sustenance stronger than bread. Yet even in the most controlled environments, sparks of rebellion burned. A maiden might deliberately overseason a lord's dish to make a silent mockery of his arrogance. She might steal an onion or a handful of berries, slipping them into her gown as she left the kitchen. She might carve initials into a wooden beam, leaving proof that she had existed in a world that refused to write her name. Small rebellions, but rebellions nonetheless tiny assertions that she was not just a servant, but a soul. The kitchen also shaped her body. Hours spent kneading dough hardened her arms. Hauling buckets bent her back. Smoke roughened her lungs, and cold floors stiffened her joints. By the age of 25, many maidens looked twice their age, or not by years, but by unrelenting labor. Life expectancy was short, but the maiden did not count her days in years. She counted them in loaves baked, pots scrubbed, and wounds endured. Still, stories persisted of maidens who rose above their station. A cook's assistant who married a steward, gaining authority over the very place where she once scrubbed floors. A scullery girl who became the trusted confidant of a lady, her fortunes tied to noble favor. Even a handful of maidens who caught the eye of their lord, not always by choice, and bore children who walked the line between servant and noble. These were rare exceptions, but they flickered like candles in the collective imagination, proof that sometimes fate bent in unexpected ways. The hidden kitchen was also where knowledge lived, not the knowledge of books, which were rare and locked away in monasteries, but the knowledge of survival. How to preserve meat with salt, how to keep ale from spoiling, how to stretch broth for one more hungry mouth. A maiden knew which herbs soothed burns, which leaves curbed hunger, which woods burned hottest and longest. This was not written wisdom, but embodied memory, passed from one pair of chapped hands to the next. In a sense, maidens were historians of hunger, their bodies carrying the knowledge that allowed families, castles, and even kingdoms to endure. And yet, the ultimate paradox of the hidden kitchen is this. While it was built on invisibility, it was also indispensable. Without the maiden's labor, the lord could not feast, the lady could not host, the castle could not function. Power was displayed in the hall, but it was manufactured in the kitchen. Every goblet of wine, every loaf of bread, every roasted boar was stamped with the fingerprints of the forgotten. To erase them from history is to misunderstand the very foundations of medieval life. So what do we make of the maiden now? She is not simply a background figure in someone else's story. She is a protagonist in her own right, though history has buried her voice. The hidden kitchen is her chronicle, one written not in ink, but in sweat, smoke, and silence. And if we listen carefully, we hear not just the story of one maiden, but the echoes of countless others whose lives lit the furnaces of medieval survival. The banquet halls are long gone, the lords and ladies buried beneath stone. But the kitchens remain in ruins of castles, in fragments of pottery, in soot-blackened hearths that archaeologists still uncover. In these remnants, we see her, the hidden maiden, whose work has been forgotten by chronicles, but preserved by the stones themselves. Every cracked oven, every scorched cauldron is her memorial. The hidden kitchen teaches us something essential, that history is not only made by kings and queens, but also by the nameless who carried water, baked bread, and kept fires burning. It forces us to question what voices we allow into history and whose silence we accept. For every shining feast, there were unseen hands. For every noble toast, there was a maiden coughing in the smoke. For every story told about lords and ladies, there is another untold, waiting beneath the surface. So the next time you hear of a medieval feast, do not imagine only the golden tables and jeweled goblets. Imagine also the hidden kitchen, where maidens bent over ovens, where laughter mixed with tears, where dreams coexisted with despair. That was the true heart of the castle, the smoky, blistered, weary, and endlessly resilient heart of the hidden kitchen of the maiden. And perhaps the greatest unvarnished truth is this: history remembers those who dined, but it was the maidens who ensured there was anything to eat at all.